"What happened when the British left Washington, D.C.?" asked Adele. "As you can imagine," Grandfather Lafitte replied, "the British were feeling very confident. They had defeated the U.S. Army in Washington and destroyed the capital. They planned to capture Baltimore next, which at the time was a very important port." "What's a port?" asked Adele. "A port is a town or city where ships stop to load and unload cargo. Baltimore was a deep water port, meaning that the water was deep enough for really big ships to sail in and dock there. Baltimore was a port where ships could send and receive goods such as flour, tobacco, and sugar," explained Grandfather Lafitte. "Besides that, Baltimore is a central location between New York and Philadelphia and Washington. But for the British it would provide a place to land a huge invading army." "So if the British destroyed the capital and then captured Baltimore, they would gain an advantage," said J.P. "That's right," said Grandfather Lafitte. "Capturing Baltimore was a key part of the British plan. From there they hoped to attack other important cities. But I will tell you what actually happened. The Battle of Baltimore can be divided into two parts: the battles on land and the battles at sea. The British general in charge of the attack on Washington, D.C., thought that they could capture Baltimore as easily as they did the capital." "That's not what happened, though," continued Grandfather Lafitte. "The people of Baltimore knew that the British were coming and they prepared themselves for a fight. The general of the U.S. Army ordered that huge earth banks called intrenchments be built along the eastern side of the city. They knew that the British soldiers would have to begin their attack there. Sure enough, one September morning the British landed several thousand soldiers at a place called North Point." "What's an entrenchment?" asked Adele. Entrenchments were like trenches dug into the ground or sometimes walls built above the ground. The entrenchments acted as a defensive wall and as a means of targeting the advancing army, explained Grandfather Lafitte. In addition to building the entrenchments, the army got ready to defend Fort McHenry. "Was the purpose of Fort McHenry to protect Baltimore's harbor?" asked J.P. "Yes, Fort McHenry was a defensive fort located right on the bay. It was built in the shape of a five-pointed star. Soldiers were perched at the tip of each star point to protect the fort from all directions. The major knew that they had to try to keep the British soldiers out or they would surely lose. The British soldiers began to advance on the city. They kept coming until they were finally pushed back by a large U.S. army." "Did the British give up?" asked J.P. "Not yet," replied Grandfather Lafitte. "They withdrew and set up camp. The next morning the battle continued. The British marched right up to the entrenchments at North Point. This time they didn't just face a larger U.S. army, but lots of cannons and other weapons too. The British quickly realized that they were outgunned. They retreated, and we won the Battle of North Point." "But what happened at Fort McHenry?" asked Adele. "That's quite a story," said Grandfather Lafitte as he laughed quietly. "The people of Baltimore had imagined that they were in for a long, hard fight, and so they prepared for one. Besides building entrenchments, they stored supplies. They even sank some of their own ships so that the British would not be able to sail into the harbor." "They sank their own ships?" asked J.P., astonished. "Yes, they did," explained Grandfather Lafitte. "Another important part of the preparation included the creation of a new flag for Fort McHenry. The commander of the fort, Major George Armistead, wanted a flag so big that the British sailors would be able to see it from far away. A lady named Mary Pickersgill was asked to make the flag." "I read a book about this once," said Adele. "Mary Pickersgill needed help to make such a big flag." "She did indeed," replied Grandfather Lafitte. Her daughter, her two nieces, and a young apprentice helped. The flag that these 5 women made had 15 stars and 15 stripes. When it was finished, the flag was as large as a house. It was actually bigger than the room they were making it in. Mary Pickersgill's flag measured 30 feet tall by 42 feet wide. It was carried to the fort and would later be hung on a giant flagpole. Do you know how many stars and stripes our flag has today? There are 13 stripes and 50 stars, JP said confidently. The 13 stripes represent the 13 original colonies, and the stars represent our 50 states. Excellent, exclaimed Grandfather Lafitte. Now let's get back to the story. Before long, the British began firing rockets at Fort McHenry. At first, the British ships were too far from the fort for the U.S. soldiers to be able to return fire. For more than 24 hours, the British pounded the fort. With little return fire, the British ships sailed closer and closer to the fort. Once they were close enough, though, our soldiers were able to return fire. That must have sounded like a terrible thunderstorm, said Adele. Probably louder than the fireworks on 4th of July, added J.P. Did we hit any British ships? Asked J.P. We sure did, said Grandfather Lafitte. In fact, the British ships were forced to pull back. They kept firing, though. However, early the next morning the British realized that they had not been able to take over the city. They stopped the attack, and the British ships sailed away. During the night the fort had flown a smaller flag, but as the British stopped firing and prepared to sail away, General Armstead directed the army to raise the enormous flag that Mary Pickersgill and her helpers made. Wow! Exclaimed J.P. and Adele together. Grandfather added, a man named Francis Scott Key watched the whole battle that night from a boat just outside of the Baltimore harbor. He saw bombs shooting through the air and watched the rockets rain down all through the day and into the night. As the sun came up, Francis Scott Key was still in the boat. He saw that enormous flag flying, and he knew that Baltimore had been saved. The United States had won the battle. Francis Scott Key wrote our national anthem, explained J.P. That's right. The events that morning inspired Francis Scott Key to write a poem that later became our national anthem, added Grandfather Lafitte. Come on, J.P., announced Adele. Let's sing the national anthem for Granddad. The two children stood up in the warm sunshine, looked at their grandfather. Together they sang the words that Francis Scott Key was inspired to write that morning so long ago. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hail as the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight over the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave? When the children were finished, Grandfather Lafitte smiled proudly at them. With his arms around their shoulders, he said, why don't we head back up to the house for a late afternoon snack? We might even hear something about those pirates, too. Sounds good to me, said Adele as she scrambled down from the hay bales. Oh, pirates! Exclaimed J.P. Then together the three walked back toward the house with their two furry friends at their heels.